So thank you for joining me today. And I want to continue talking about early devotion to Mary. So I'm interested in the question of when did devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary begin in Christianity? And one way to look at this is to think, is to go with the narrative that devotion to Mary was something that came about gradually, right? So you may see some art in the second century that depicts the Madonna and Child, and then you might begin to see certain prayers and certain sort of things that indicate that there was a growth in devotion to Mary. But what I'll do here is actually sort of challenge the narrative that this was something that was an accretion or something that evolved with time, and I'm sort of making the claim that Marian devotion began robustly at the highest level. So what you really see today in the Roman Catholic Church and in churches that espouse very robust Marian devotion is not something that gradually builds over time, but it's more an unfolding of what was already there. Okay. Now, so in a series of previous videos, I've looked at different ways of thinking of Mary. I've talked about, just a general overview of why is Mary so important? Is she some kind of divine feminine or, what have you? And I argue that Mary is an essential feature of Christianity. That's like, you just cannot have this religion, Christianity, without Mary. And then I went to the New Testament and I looked at Mary in Paul's gospel, in Paul's writings, and then looked at Mary in the Gospel of Mark. And so Mary does not feature in Paul's writings, except somewhat implicitly, where we see, I argue that Mary's presence, implicit presence in Paul, is there to defend or protect the identity of Jesus, that the fact that he's very much Jewish, he's human, and that this human man is God. Okay, now, but he doesn't mention her explicitly. Now, we also see something similar in Mark. Mark does not really focus on Mary per se. There's one instance where he talks about son of Mary, and there's another part where he talks about the family of Jesus. But otherwise, Mary is not a featured part of that. And so I asked the question, is Mary necessary for the gospel? And the question has to do, no, because Mark shows us that you could have a complete gospel without featuring Mary at all, right? So that tells us, that Mary is not essential. Okay, so now I want to take a look at the Gospel of Luke, because I think this is very interesting, and this is where I think Marian devotion explodes on the scene. Okay, so it doesn't come in as a slight peak. It's not like the door was open. It comes hard and comes fast, and it is explosive. So setting up the Gospel of Luke and why I'm sort of making this claim. Now, when we think of the Gospel of Mark begins, it says, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And gospel means good news. The Greek is evangelion. So it's the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, of the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Mark is considered the earliest in written form, And the consensus is that Matthew and Luke use Mark as a reference. So please note, I'm not saying they use Mark as a source, but as a reference. All right. And so it's clear that they both valued this writing, which it's possible in the second century, Justin referred to Gospel of Mark, if it's Gospel of Mark, as the memoirs of, I think, Peter. All right, so Matthew and Luke use the Gospel of Mark as a reference, right? And that becomes important because that's an authorial choice. They make a choice. They looked at the Gospel of Mark and said, yes, this reflects what we know to be the tradition of the apostles. And so they take it. So that's, first of all, that is a choice that they make. Okay. And I'm using this word choice at the same time, I was keeping in mind the idea of inspiration, that the scriptures are inspired by God. Of course, what inspiration means is going to differ, by group. But let's just say, in some way, we could say that God is responsible for the scriptures. How about that? All right, so one choice we see then with Matthew and Luke is that, first of all, they decide to use Mark. And then you can think about this. Mark says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So the claim Son of God, what exactly does that mean? It's very important in Mark because, remember, the demons in Mark keep saying, you are the Son of God. And he shuts them up. And then no one else can quite figure out who Jesus is. And even the people who stumble on to something don't really understand. It's not until Jesus is crucified that the centurion on the cross who sees the dead, Christ says, truly this man was the Son of God. It required that Jesus go through all of that ministry, his submission to death, and his crucifixion as the obedient Son to be recognized as the Son of God. Okay, so Mark doesn't really explain what Son of God means, but Matthew and Luke, it appears they want to make sure that they do so. So again, we know, at least we are, the general consensus that they use Mark as a reference. And it's clear they both feel like that story needs to be expanded, that the gospel, so Mark, might consider an innovation with Mark, who knows, that Mark's idea of the gospel is that it has to be a story from John the Baptist to the resurrection and commissioning. But Luke and Matthew say, well, this story actually begins with the birth of Christ because that's important. So that's a choice that they make. The infancy narrative is a choice. That's a story about circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth and the circumstances of his birth and what happens immediately after his childhood. All right, so Matthew focuses on Jesus' link to Abraham, David, and through Joseph. The announcement of Jesus' birth is to Joseph. And that's where in Matthew's gospel, we encounter the Magi who worship the new king. And we see the story of the Holy Family who escaped that horrific fate that befell many of the infants at the hand of King Herod in Bethlehem. And now Matthew is interesting because you can see, especially in the infancy narrative, he says things like, this was to fulfill the scriptures, that, And again, that's a choice. Matthew is writing to make a particular point, and he wants to show how Jesus' life fulfills the scriptures. Okay, so scholars would say something like the community that Matthew is writing for, and that Matthew belonged to, it's a community that may have considered itself on the spectrum of self-identified Judaic sects. So they Christianity, just to be clear, in the first century was still pretty much understood as Judaism. Okay, many of them self-identify that way. With time, as centuries pass, you have both religions in some way split. What becomes the rabbinic Judaism of the present time and what becomes Christianity sort of split. But, there was a time they were all part of the spectrum of Judaism. But Matthew's community may have more closely self-identified with that sort of Judaic element. So it was very important for them to show that Jesus was in conformity with the scriptures and Jesus was the new Moses, right? And so this reflects compositional choices, that Matthew is making choices about how he wants to tell the gospel story. Now, I'm not saying Matthew's making up anything. I'm just saying there are choices about how he wants to tell the story. And as an inspired writer, that means he's moved to do this, okay? But we can't take the author out of this. The author is important here because there's a narrative and a very interesting narrative that Matthew wants to share. Now, so pivoting from that, we go to Luke, right? Because now that I'm speaking about the choices of, say, Matthew and Luke, right? They both choose to use Mark as a reference. They both choose to expand on what it means to be son of God by including the infancy narratives. So let's look at Luke. So Luke, whoever he was, and the authors of the Gospels don't self-identify, so we can't necessarily say we know who they are. The names come to us from tradition, and we just take them as is, so as they are, right? And so we take Luke to be the author of the Gospel of Luke. And whoever Luke was, he understood himself to be in a privileged position. He was not one of the original eyewitnesses, but he was confident enough in his standing, his position, to write authoritatively. So try to think about that, right? This is someone who was not an original eyewitness. Now, in some Christian traditions, that's important, that's today. In other Christian traditions, it seems to be less important. But for traditions that understand that tradition is everything, tradition is everything. The Bible is tradition. Everything is tradition. The eyewitness testimony is vital, because that's really, Christianity is not really this, like, it's not an idea, a blueprint floating out there that's like a mold where you pour stuff in and then it spits out Christianity wherever it lands. It is a tradition that begins with Jesus, his apostles, his disciples, and that unbroken chain of tradition. Okay. So the eyewitnesses were always important in early Christianity. So let's look at what Luke says at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. He says, so this is the first four verses of Luke. He says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed." Okay, so that's the first four verses of the Gospel of Luke. All right, some noteworthy things here is that, first, at the time of Luke's writing, it is clear that there are many narratives out there about Jesus and about this new religion, right? So there are many narratives out there. So he says many have undertaken to compile a narrative, right? So that's one thing we always have to keep in mind, is that there are many narratives. This is not like the common, our age, where it's easy to fact check things, verify things, go on the internet, go into some sort of library or records. If someone showed up in town and told you a story, there was really no way to fact check it. You kind of believed, or you had to wait for some kind of confirmation. So there were many of these. Apparently, there were many narratives out there about Jesus, written narratives. Okay, and these were things. So it says that these were exist narratives about the life of Jesus and events that followed. That's the things accomplished among us. Okay, now the interesting thing about Luke is that these things that were accomplished among us, he says they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. All right, so whoever Luke is, he's a second generation Christian, so to speak, as in, maybe not second generation, that may not be accurate, but he's not an eyewitness. And the eyewitnesses, he's one of the us whom the eyewitnesses brought the tradition to. So the eyewitnesses and people who are considered ministers of the word are the ones who took the words of Jesus, the life and story of Jesus, and passed them on. And that's vital. There had to be the clear provenance. There had to be this chain of custody, so to speak, of this information, of the practices that passed on. So this was not, again, it's not like there is an idea out there, and if you tap into it, you get everything. This religion was specifically, what was Jesus about? What did Jesus do? What did he say? And it's only the eyewitnesses, those who were there, right, who had the authority. This is why Paul had a very difficult time in his day and age, because he wasn't one of the eyewitnesses, and so he had to defend his apostleship. Okay, so the the provenance of when I say provenance of the chain of custody, the ancestry of the information, so to speak, this idea was not incidental. It really did matter who the story came from. The story of the about Jesus, and so Luke says, like, just as many have written about Jesus, it seemed good to me also, right? So all these people have done that. I think it's a good idea for me to do it, right? So Luke does not claim inspiration. Okay, I'm not saying he was an inspired writer, but it's important to note that just the person didn't say, I'm being moved by God to write. It's like, it just seemed like a good idea for me to write. Now, why is that? The reason is because he had the sort of access that granted him unquestioned status, right? And so Luke, whoever it was the kind of person that had the reputation of being close, in direct contact with the people who were ministers of the word and eyewitnesses. And people knew that. And he says, it seemed like a good idea to me because I know these people. I'm going to write, and he's going to write an orderly account. So that's what's interesting. So whatever it is, whatever that means, orderly account, it does mean it's intentional, right? He knows what he's doing. He's arranging it the way he's arranging it. He has particular thoughts about how he wants to set up this thing he's writing. Okay, and he says, I'm writing this for you, most excellent Theophilus. So Theophilus could be lover of God. So it could have been an actual person, or it could be a general, refer to just anyone who's a lover of God. Let's just say it's an actual person. He said, I'm writing this for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed. So again, this is a point that you often hear a lot of Catholics make, that the Bible is not the source of Christianity. It's the other way around. The Bible reflects the tradition. So it's a crystallized form of the tradition that is preeminent, but it reflects the tradition. So it's not that he's writing this account so Theophilus can learn about Jesus, but he's saying, Theophilus, you already know this story about Jesus. So I am writing an intentional account to confirm what you already know. Okay, so in this case, what we see is that Luke is intentionally crafting a narrative. He's making very specific choices about what he wants to do, and he's going to, pass this on to Theophilus, so that Theophilus can feel reassured by someone who seems to have access to the very people who are eyewitnesses and who are ordained as ministers of the word. Okay, so Luke is calling attention to himself as the author. He doesn't tell us his name, but he's calling attention to himself, and he's basing this on his reputation. You know me, right? I know these people, and I'm going to give you an orderly account. So what Luke is doing, he's saying, you can trust me because I have access to all the people, and I'm intentionally writing this in a very particular way so that you can feel reassured. Okay. So, broadly speaking, we're introduced to a hermeneutical principle of guiding our approach to scriptures, that scriptures are really a product of tradition. The scripture is a product of tradition. They're not the origin of tradition, right? So they are not the origin of the Christian faith. The Christian faith is a reflection of the tradition. Scriptures are a reflection of the tradition that's already there. So you should see the scripture as this very special record of this inspired tradition. Okay, and so if we when we return briefly to Mark, we note that Mark relates the gospel about Jesus Christ and never sees it necessary to highlight Mary, right? She's referred to obliquely as Jesus' family. He talks about Jesus as son of Mary, but her specific role as mother, who she is, none of that's there in Mark. So, Mark does not see Mary as necessary. So when we look at the Gospel of Luke and he puts Mary front and center, like she's the first thing you're going to run into, and like, yep, that's an example of of a true disciple, of a holy person, a special person, the mother of our Lord, the mother of God, right? She takes center stage right up the bat, and it is a choice that Luke makes. Okay, so Luke is the first Christian author who is unabashed in his veneration of Mary. So if you want to investigate the beginnings of Marian devotion, look no further than Luke's treatment, which starts Marian devotion on this transcendent trajectory. Mary is introduced, an angel, first of all, she's introduced as someone who God is impressed with. An angel is privileged to be in her presence. The Holy Spirit speaking through Elizabeth calls Mary, mother of my Lord, mother of God. So it launches Mary into that orbit right off the bat. So this is sort of the case where I'm sort of making about Mary, that her presence in Luke, her introduction in Luke is not incidental, it's intentional, right? That Luke wants to make her a major part of the story. Again, you don't have to, right? Because we see the Gospel of Mark did not have Mary at all. Not necessary. But Luke says, I'm going to put her there, and I'm going to say some very specific things about Mary. Okay, and then sort of launch from there. So the case I'm making here is that Marian devotion starts robustly with an explosion from the Gospel of Luke, where he focuses that first chapter on Mary, so that everyone knows that this is how this whole thing begins. This is the story that introduces our Lord Jesus, and then begins to move the whole thing forward. Now, in next series of videos, I want to look at some, first of all, the Annunciation, which is the encounter of Mary with the angel, look at her Magnificat, and look at her encounter with Elizabeth, and just see what those things tell us about how Luke is presenting Mary, and how Mary becomes part of this Christian ethos. One thing I do want you to think about, just try to think about Christianity in its earliest form, whatever the religion was called back then. Okay, now there's a tendency we have now to spiritualize Christianity, and it's sort of an unfortunate tendency. We have spiritualized everything, but it's a very physical religion, and that's what it is. Judaism. The idea of the resurrection is, it's everything, right? It's the idea that it's not this idea of. So let's contrast it, say, with the Greek perspective, and a perspective that's very common in Christianity now, which is that you die and your soul goes to heaven. And then there's this weird idea of, well, if my soul goes on to heaven and is in heaven, why on earth do I need my body? All right, that's because we very often tend to identify our true self with the soul or spirit, and the body is more like a house or something like that, right? But the biblical approach is more that you're this embodied being. I mean, your body is you, is as much you as anything else. So the resurrection of the body is you being restored to life, and to a new kind of life, and that is what is special. So Christianity is really a very physical religion, and so it's when they talked about Jesus, it wasn't that you're speaking about some idea of Jesus, but it was that man who walked in Galilee and Jerusalem. And his particular words that he spoke were very important to them. Okay, so keeping that in mind, when Jesus celebrates his Passover with them and institutes Eucharist and says, "This is my body, this is my blood," that is a very, very sort of tangible, serious thing for them. Like it is important. It was very important to them, for those who actually were in the presence of the Lord, who heard him, who talked to him, who touched him. And we see that in John. John says, like, we heard the word of life. We touched him. We were in his presence. We heard his voice. Okay. So what we see is that Christianity in its earliest form was a very physical religion. Now, try to imagine what that means. If you're in a place like, say, there's a tradition that Mary was in Ephesus, with the Apostle John, and you go to one of his house gatherings, and and as you're sitting there and you hear the Apostle John's coming and you're in reverence, this is one of the people who walked with the Lord. And you say, wow, what was it like to actually have been there, to have touched Christ? And someone says, well, you know what? And Mary comes walking in, and this hush probably falls over the room, because what you're looking at is the woman who in her womb carried God, and her flesh is the flesh of God. You want to know what that word of life was? Touch her. Her flesh was actually God's flesh. That's what he took. There's no father involved. You can imagine the reverence that would come with the actual presence of this woman who raised Jesus, who was with him all the way, who was at the cross with him, who talked with him more than anyone else did, who understood him better, and she carried him in her womb. And his flesh is her flesh. Her flesh is his. You can imagine the sort of reverence that would come about that, right? And so a point I'd made in an earlier video was that Mary is something of a test for Christians. Like I would think that there's not much told us about Marian devotion specifically. This is what you ought to do. But it's a very interesting thing, because here you have basically this tabernacle of God. And the question is, you put it there and you just see how people react to that, right? And I think this is what you're seeing with the Gospel of Luke is this devotion to this woman who was literally the tabernacle of God, who was a temple. She bore God in her womb. The actual presence of God was within her. And she gave birth. And she wasn't just a canal that, God sort of shot through. She conceived him, okay? So all that to say is that, yes, given the fact that this religion is not the spiritualized thing that we tend to see today, but was a very physical religion, that Mary was the bearer of God. She bore him in a womb. Her flesh is Jesus' flesh. You can understand why this devotion would percolate and begin to sort of explode, and it makes its way into the Gospel of Luke, and we'll see into John's Gospel too. Okay, and that's a choice that was made, and it's a choice in response to devotion. So again, to conclude this, the point here I'm making is that Mary's beginning of devotion to Mary, I argue, begins the Gospel of Luke, and it starts out with a bang, and it's not something that sort of gradually increases or is an accretion, something that's added gradually to Christianity. It is there right from the beginning in the New Testament. And it is a choice that was made, an inspired choice, and Mary does become a test for us, right? That, all generations will call me blessed, and there's a reason for that. Okay, so the next few videos, I hope to look at some of these aspects of the Gospel of Luke, what Mary says, and what we can learn about devotion to Mary from these texts. All right.